So I will start by telling you like a little bit about what my job is, and then I'll tell you how I got here, and then I'll finish up with like how I go about doing the work that I do. And if you have any questions at any point, please raise your hand or signal me in some way, and I'm happy to answer. So I work at the Academy of Natural Sciences, which is the oldest natural history collection in the country. So I like to think of it like the basis of how science is practiced in the US, and therefore we have a lot of power to also change how science is practiced in the US. Like we have a lot of things that belong to Lewis and Clark on their like first expedition around the US. Like I've seen their notebook and like one sprig of tobacco they managed to not smoke. And so like that's the space that I work in. And I've been at the Academy in various capacities for about 3 years. There is a program that the Academy has with Drexel University, and as a college student you more than likely will have to do at least one, maybe up to 3 co-op programs. So you spend 6 months every year working. And in 2020, my plan was to go to Cambodia, and a week before my flight, the pandemic hit U.S. ground, and they halted all study abroad programs, which sucked. It was a week away from my flight. I was really excited to go there, but safety is important, and so I was like, okay, if I have to work for 6 months, what is it that I'm going to do? Luckily, I was already a part of a research lab, and there was some extra funding at the university, specifically because a lot of folks co-ops got canceled as it relates to the pandemic, and so they had money for folks to do research, maybe design their own research. At the time, the research I was doing was focusing on accessible language and science communication, because it's really filled with jargon. It's, again, the basis of how science has been practiced in this country, where a lot of rich white men wanted to other and study other things, and I'm trying to have science in a way that it's everybody's business. It's accessible to everyone. The language and the words I use make sense to everyone. And so that's where I started from. And what I was really interested in, but the team didn't have capacity to look at, was how access to green space in a systematic way can affect students' STEM identity development. And so STEM identity development is the likelihood that any person here in this room could describe themselves as a scientist or see that they have a trajectory to do science in the world later. And a lot of preliminary research shows that just the ability to spend time outside and like be curious, and just that allows folks to see that this is something that they're interested in and that they can study and that they will want to study. And for me personally, I'm interested in the outdoors because I'm Jamaican American. I spent most of my childhood in Jamaica at the beach, climbing waterfalls in the jungle. And I'm also from South Florida. So again, at the beach, in the mangroves and swamps. And then I ended up with an environmental science degree. So I'm pretty granola. I love to be outside. So was working on that project where we were looking to match different schools within the city of Philadelphia with various green spaces around them. So figuring that if we wanted an elementary school to have access to green space, that needed to be closer to where they are. But high school students may have a bit more leeway to get farther away from campus during the day, and then eventually get to the point where we could work with science faculty to design curriculum specifically for STEM identity development. And then the next year, I had to do another co-op, and I'm like, we have been in this pandemic for 2 years, and I would like to go outside. Like, I don't care what I'm doing, as long as I get to go outside and do field work. Another professor, another lab that I was in, she is a wetland scientist. Like, I presented in a conference for her, and she was like, "Hi, I'm Beth, I like dirt." So like, for context, those are the kind of folks that I'm working with. And so what she was studying is saltwater inundation in salt marshes. So we all have heard that the sea level is rising, but like, what does that mean in various ways? So if we have soil here and the water is getting higher and higher, that also means that the salt content is mixing more with the soil. And so marshes are places that exist like right at the border of the ocean and in the land. Well, not always ocean, there are saltwater marshes, but at a watermark and land, and these are spaces that can have a lot of water in them. But we have been seeing a lot more ghost forest, and that is when the trees they look like a ghost. They're all dried out, they start to turn white, and that is directly related to saltwater inundation. And so we're looking at how the increase of that is affecting coastal upland forest around the region. I did some research in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and then looked at a separate research project that she was doing in California. And this was really lovely. I was just happy to be outside in natural spaces. But that is not where my intellect lies. And my professor was like, I would really appreciate it if you could do something that you're passionate about. And so she, at the time, was on the board of the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. And that is a nonprofit organization that is based in Wilmington, Delaware. But they do the technical reporting for the watershed that we all live in. And so the watershed will be the rivers, the creeks, and all in-ground water and like that connectedness. And so we live in the Mid-Atlantic watershed, and our watershed starts from right below New York City, all of New Jersey, all of Pennsylvania, and then through Delaware. And we're feeding about like 15 million people, like monitoring what their access to water is. And in this technical report that gets, I don't think I mentioned the technical report. She brought me on the team so that I could audit the technical report, because in the history of this organization, they've never taken a systematic look at how the research they're doing and the way that they take care of the environment, how it affects the people who live there. And so I led them through a social justice audit. I read 479 pages of this technical document and was like, you should be thinking about people here. You should be reaching out to rural farmers here. I helped them to write a call out box specifically for the flooding that's happening in Eastwick in Philadelphia. And I gave them the move to have a chapter that's dedicated to climate change. And as I was working on that project, we brought in the lead data scientist at the academy. And there were a lot of changes happening at the academy because, we're going to be honest, science is historically and institutionally racist. And there are a lot of folks who know that, but a lot of people who are like within the system trying to change it. And so this person that I was working with, Roman, was on a team called WJAG. Don't remember what the acronym stands for because there are way too many acronyms out here. But essentially they did an audit for the way that the academy does their work. It was like, how can we make all of the work that we do more socially inclusive and like do more things to specifically go against racism as it's ingrained in our society? And so we have this really old museum like trying to make this change, and they have guidelines of like how to do that on a top-down level, but then we also need the folks in the building who also agree with this. And that was where my boss was kind of stuck, was like, I'm glad that we're moving forward, but I don't really want to bring folks into this space that aren't equipped to deal with what they're walking into. And I was like, hey, I work here. You know that I can do this work. I've just led this entire technical audit. And they were like, okay, like, let me do you a quick interview, see what kind of work that we can get you involved in. And the project that I ended up doing was, so the Academy, we lead the science direction for the William Penn Foundation, which is like one of the founding families of Philadelphia. They are involved heavily in all sorts of charitable work, but also like a lot of real estate. So a really wealthy family trying to figure out how they can use their wealth in a systematic way to do good. And what they asked me to do was to figure out like metrics for equitable water conservation. And I'll have, those are just random words. That does not actually mean anything. And so in doing research and just like trying to figure out a systemized way that we could make sure that all of the water that we're talking about is equally accessible to, again, 15 million people. So we're talking about cities, we're talking about suburbs, we're talking about straight up farms. So these are a lot of different folks with varying needs. And it is impossible to think that sitting in a building wherever William Penn is headquartered, that you would be able to know that work. And so what I came across in that process was something called participatory action research. And participatory action research is essentially the idea that if I would like to help a community solve a problem, this community needs to be integral in the research process because their local knowledge is invaluable, and it's something that I'm not going to be able to Google or read in a book. But I'm also trained as a scientist, and so I have certain technical expertise that they may not have, or my institution has certain like technology they may not have access to. And so how do we bridge that gap and meet people in the middle where they are? And so I introduced that concept to what I heavily pushed the concept at the Academy a couple years ago, and like luckily William Penn is very interested in what I've presented, and now they're looking at how they can integrate community in all of the work that they do. And so that brings me to one of the projects that I now currently work on, which is called the Resilient City Stormwater Initiative. And so what William Penn is interested in doing is having little subsects of Philadelphia. So right now we're working with the Kingsessing neighborhood, but they want to add green stormwater infrastructure so that we could work on flood mitigation and also collecting pollution, but also make sure that it's strategically placed and designed by community. So these green spaces are actually meeting the needs of the community. Like, do you want to grow some food here? Do you want this to be a place where you can smell flowers? Do you want to sit down? Is this a place for the church to have Bible study? Like, what do we need? And the only way to figure that out is to have the community be a part of that process. And so my current role at the Academy is community science specialist, and I coordinate a research program called Science Shop for Climate Resilience, where we're doing all of this work through a participatory action research lens. When I started in October, I was added on to the RCSI project, and at that point, they had already created the Green Living Plan, which is identifying where we need more trees in Philadelphia based on like where it's not, where it's hottest, where the pollution is, where runoff is, like where communities are saying they needed. And then we found 5 different groups around the city, decided that Kingsessing was the most realistic group to start with. And we have been meeting with community members once a month since October. At this point, we have designed we have like 3 different corridor tracks, but we have presented designs for like various green spaces that have been designed with the community. And so like that's how that project is going. And that's one example of the kind of work that I do. Another project that I was again added on is working with the Overbrook Environmental Education Center in West Philadelphia. And how that project was set up was essentially we were like, we have money to help you answer a question. What question do you need answered? And so before I got there was a co-op student who led a bunch of like roundtables, and they had community events, and we have decided that the most pressing issue for the community members are blood lead levels in children and lead in soil. We've also identified that the reason that this is most prevalent in West Philadelphia as compared to the rest of the city is because of specific housing structures. So these houses were built around the 1950s, if not a little bit earlier. They were all built with lead materials because that was best practice at the time. But now with the gentrification rates we're seeing, a lot of folks are like hitting down these buildings. And when they do that, all of the dust particles, they go up in the air, and it takes a while for them to settle. So when they're knocking down houses, we're seeing like a lot more elevated issues of asthma or breathing problems. And then when it settles into the ground, then you have kids running around barefoot, and then they go in their house, and then the lead is all in the house. And so we're at the process where we have identified about 5 different lead experts in Philadelphia who are interested in working with this community. And together we're going to figure out like what is an actionable solution that benefits the community for the long term, for the end of the grant, but also will push policy forward so that these changes don't keep happening. Yeah. And then another grant that I'm working on right now is funded by the Philadelphia Water Department as well as Mural Arts. They're interested in working with East Germantown residents to look at flood mitigation because everywhere is flooding. It is so unfortunate, but we live at sea level rise, and the realistic truth is that we are not going to stop flooding. And so what we need to do is better understand the causes where it's happening and build infrastructure that helps us live with that if we're not in a position to be able to leave those spaces, because that is a lot to ask of folks. And so that's the kind of thing that we're looking at and meeting with this group. And I really like this project because we're not only working with community members, but we're also working with artists from the area. And we have decided that one of the things that we want to do is have a resource center. So we're looking for storefronts that will be easily accessible to the residents that we're looking to work with, but also keeping in mind things like public transportation, ADA accessibility, like what does parking look like, And this will be a space where we can host events, but also have workshops. Resource providers can show up, and it'll essentially be the place in the neighborhood that if you have an issue or a question relating to flooding, you can go there and you know that someone from PWD or whoever else will be there to be able to answer your question. If you decide that what you need is help lifting everything in your basement, then we have funding to create programs to help folks do that. And then the third project that I'm working on, which is a really big grant, is being funded by NOAA. And it's a 3-year program where they want us to do multiple science projects. So they're you have 3 years. We want you to work with 3 different organizations to answer whatever questions they have, as long as the end goal addresses something about climate literacy. There was already a working relationship with the Academy of Natural Sciences and the Environmental Collaboratory at Drexel, where we are working with 2 different communities in Delaware along the Route 9 corridor. The issues that they're interested in are surprise flooding, but also air pollution, because this is the industrial corridor of the state. And so there are elevated cancer rates. There's also blue shine in the oil and the water when it is flooding, and trying to figure out those questions. And then because one of the things the Academy is looking at me to do is to determine how to be in relationship with communities differently. Historically, a lot of our relationships have been with organizations that are coming from some sort of historical family money, and that's all well and great. They do their best to try and help folks, but I'm also if we want to help Black and brown folks, we need Black and brown folks in the building, so why are we not working with them? It's not that hard to be in relationship. You just go to communities, say what you're interested in, own the space that you're at, and ask them if they would like to work with you, and that's all it takes. And so I have been able to, with this grant that we're working on in Germantown, I'm bringing them in to be one of our partners on this NOAA grant. And then I live in Camden, New Jersey, and across the street is the Center for Environmental Transformation. I currently sit on their Environmental Justice Advisory, and I'm applying to join their board in the fall. But in the meantime, they will be the third partner that we're working on with this project. And so for the next 3 years, hoping to work with a group in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, and in Delaware, looking at how issues of flooding and air pollution are interrelated in these very similar urban spaces, but also why are they different? Yeah, so those are the main things that I'm doing on my job. But also, you guys are all here working on a farm, and I love that. I love to put my hands in dirt. I've been volunteering and farming for a number of years in my free time, and I decided that I wanted to figure out how to bring that work into the Academy. And so the VP that I work for said that it is up to me to make relationships with the community gardens around the city and figure out what is the need for the Academy in that space, and figure out what is the best way for us to move forward. I'm also doing some work to design community-based learning courses in collaborations with gardens. We have a course running this fall that's on food and land security. And so looking at how land tenureship in these various spaces affect the kind of programming they're able to do, and the effect that it has on the community. No, that's a good point. I really like scheduling. And so I'm good at portioning my time, but also how I ended up with this job specifically. So as I told you, I was working on a project that has to do with the science direction of the William Penn Foundation. And that was my senior year of college. And I was applying for Fulbright at the time. And I was pretty certain that I was going to end up in Cambodia for a year. So when I was asking for this job, I was hey, you should hire me for 6 months. And then I'll leave for a year. I'll work part-time and then I'll come back. And so luckily I was able to finish that project while I was in Cambodia. But then coming back, they needed to make an argument for me to keep working at the museum. And so the folks that I were working with were well, what are you interested in? What do you want to do? And at that point, I'd already figured out that the best way to do science, at least science that I believe in, is through a participatory action lens. And so I was whatever I'm doing has to be intentional about how we're engaging community, but also knowing that I wanted to make sure that I had a hybrid schedule, and what I did was community-based, and so I didn't have to be in the museum, and I could go outside and do whatever I wanted to when I wanted to do. Me showing up here at this garden is well within the reins of my job, and I'm also very lucky to be working with folks that let me decide what I want to do. Yeah, that does remind me of like all of the other things that I was doing. So I'm working on this grant in Germantown with some artists, and one of the artists connected me to this group in Camden, the Littoral Society. And so right now in general, there is a lot of motion to make the Delaware River recreational friendly. Like people do voting and like water monitoring, but like you can't swim. And like I've been seeing people jet ski, but I don't know how they're getting on there. But like for it to actually be safe. And so there's a lot of different folks working on that. Definitely a lot of people at my museum. But I will be working with the Littoral Society on this yearly grant to do a community-based art project. And so what I'm going to do is lead some folks around various sites of the Delaware River and have them take photos. It's like, why? Like, just take a pretty photo. Maybe it's a picture of you in it. Maybe it's a cool animal you see here. And then we're going to do some collage work and embroidery work on top of these pictures. And then it'll be pasted onto a map of the river and put in a book. And it's going to be a traveling art exhibit that the Littoral Society is going to have for the next year. So I'll be working on that in August.
Did it?
Yeah.
Give a round of applause.
Thank you.